to Orthodox Christian Theology is Craig Truglia, and with me today, again, with the history of the papacy, is John Collorafi. How are we doing today, John?
Fine, Craig, and I'm happy to be with you again and with the audience, and we promised them the most detailed treatment of this topic that's been done any kind of program like this, and I think we certainly did our utmost to deliver last time, and I don't intend to leave the audience disappointed today either.
Well, I don't think you will, because we've already been speaking in advance about Latin and Ireaneus, Greek and St. Ignatius, so I already know there's going to be real good content in this episode. Just so people are aware, John is a lay expert in the history of papacy and Roman Catholicism in the early church, and he is calling into the show, and so that's why if the audio sounds like this, sounds like a call-in on a radio, well, because it is a call-in. And so if there needs to be any tinker with the audio, please let me know, and we'll try to tinker with it. Now, I want to give everyone just a brief introduction to what we're doing, not only last episode, the next subsequent episodes, in this history of the papacy. The Bishop of Rome, over the centuries, of course, was the single most important Christian on earth. And what we're going to cover today is the history of the papacy. Though the term papacy is an anachronism, we will use the term because of its popular acceptance. What we're really going to be discussing is the history of the Bishop of Rome and his synod. By God's grace, we will undergo an unprecedented presentation on this subject. Never has the history of this institution been covered from its origins up until a century before the Great Schism in a methodical, well-rounded way. There's both an Orthodox, as in myself, and a Catholic, as in John, lay experts. We're both read in the primary sources, and our task will be to make available to the listener the content necessary to become informed on this subject. The hope is that this will create a fair and balanced overall presentation, which will leave the viewer more informed in the subject than he or she would otherwise be hearing only one side in isolation. Now, though we, the presenters, are going to strive for impartiality, the listener should expect that the Orthodox and Catholic sides will have very different presuppositions, which may color, keywords may, their presentations. The Orthodox side may presume upon the papacy corresponding to Orthodox canonical norms, which, despite elements of headship exercised by the Pope, such as the capacity to hear appeals, subjugates the Bishop of Rome to a conciliar system which has the final say. Now, the Catholic side will likely presume upon the papacy corresponding to Catholic canon law, which asserts the Pope has supreme, immediate, and universal ordinary power and dogmatic infallibility. One should strive for transparency when inferences made from the historical evidence are colored by such presuppositions. Now, each century of church history will be covered in a singular episode up until the 9th century. 4 or 5 different topics per century are covered. The goal is that each side will speak for about 5 to 7 minutes on each topic on average. We maybe go over, but we will try to honor the honor rule when it comes to time. John has done a lot of really valuable research on this topic, and so I'm not going to cut him short if he is saying things that are important. So we'll try our best to condense the information, but not to condense content. The Orthodox and Catholic side will alternate who presents first, so no side has the final word each time. And after all the topics are presented, each speaker will have about 5 minutes to offer closing thoughts on the century. There will be no live question and answers to reduce the show time. We want to make this condensed and informative, so please like this video, share it, leave questions, and we can respond to them in writing or in future question and answer episodes to be announced. So, John, the topics we're going to be covering today are St. Ignatius' letter to the Romans, the shepherd Hermas and the alleged plural episcopacy of Rome, St. Ireaneus on Rome and against Heresies, Book 3, and the Easter or Pascha controversy. And we will have you present the issue of Ignatius' letter to the Romans first. And I'll just pray real briefly before we start through the prayers of Holy Father, Saints Peter and Paul. May both the presenters and listeners be blessed by God in this endeavor. Amen. So, John, when you're ready, we could get started on St. Ignatius' letter of Romans and whatever else you find relevant to that topic.
Okay, fine. That'll be fine. I wasn't expecting to go first, but, as you like it. That'll be fine. So, first of all...
Oh, wait. John, you're right. I was supposed to go first. We talked about this off air.
Yeah.
All right, I will go first. My apologies. All right. So, Ignatius' letter to the Romans. I want to say this from the onset. This is a tremendously papal source if we read it with care. I wager you this, audience, that if we actually parse the original languages, there could be no doubt of this. And it really is a shame that this is not spoken about more often. Now, let me just start with right in chapter 1 of Ignatius' Romans. He says, "The church, which has obtained mercy through the majesty of the Most High, worthy of God, worthy of honor, worthy of the highest happiness, worthy of praise, worthy of obtaining her every desire, worthy of being deemed holy, and presides over love." All right, so he's saying that the Church of Rome presides over love. Now, when you look in the Greek, I'm getting better at pronouncing Greek, but I'm still not quite anywhere close to there yet. If we literally translate the Greek there, presides over love, it's like the word primate, but a verb, primates. Then the definite article, the, aiapes, which is love / maybe goodwill as a singular genitive noun. It's the similar word as love feast in Jude, verse 12. So why do I bring up the genitive noun thing? Well, genitive nouns denote that possession or close association. So John could correct me, but here's my literal translation of the Greek looking up these things in dictionaries, which is presides over love, more accurate would be rules there the love feast. The being the definite article. Now this sounds awkward, so let me kind of put it in more layman's English. Rules their one and only love feast. It's calling the Roman Church the one who presides over the church, the love feast. So how is the love feast of the church Rome's? This is a very important question because, quite frankly, because that definite article in the Greek and that term aiape, like we see in Jude verse 12, it's something that is, to me, exceedingly clear when we see the Greek, and it's kind of, English translation does not do it justice. Now, the reference may be to local jurisdiction, that Rome's chief role for churches in Asia Minor, evangelized by Peter and Paul, right? That they preside, they rule over the love feast. It may be the love feast is that local jurisdiction, but something universal is also possible. And when we get into the role of Antioch vis-a-vis Rome, this is certainly a reasonable interpretation. Now, in Romans chapter 2, St. Ignatius writes, "Us being gathered together in love, God has deemed me, the bishop of Syria, worthy to be sent from the east unto the west." So we have to see, being that he's speaking of love as the love feast, gathered together in love is likely a reference or euphemism for shared communion, right? A shared love feast. He's saying we're all part of one big love feast, one Eucharist. This is Eucharistic language. Now in Romans chapter 3, Ignatius writes, "You have never envied anyone, you have taught others. Now I desire that those things may be confirmed by your conduct, which in your instructions you enjoin others." So the "you have taught others" refers to those Rome has authority over in a teaching authority. Consists of the idea that Rome rules the love feast or the church. So we're seeing a very consistent thread here in this book. Now what's this likely in reference to? My guess it's in reference to 1st and 2nd Clement, the latter particularly appearing to be an encyclical against antinomianism, and that may explain its popularity in the manuscript record. But this shows that it was understood that churches would look to Rome for teaching, for encyclicals. This is not some sort of medieval invention. This is referenced in Romans chapter 3 of Ignatius. Now, the teaching may have been for church-wide, as in all the jurisdictions, all the local patriarchates, so to say, that's a anachronism when it comes to the word patriarchate. For church-wide consumption, though 1st Clement, just to be specific, is really a response to a local appeal. So even if it was made for church-wide consumption, it really does address an intra-patriarchal dispute. But that being said, Ignatius appears very aware of the existence of these teachings. Now, Romans chapter 4, Ignatius writes, "I write to the churches and impress on them all," right? He's the Bishop of Antioch. "I impress on them all that I shall willingly die for God. unless you, as in Rome, hinder me. Allow me to become good food for the wild beast. I do not, as Peter and Paul, issue commandments unto you. They were apostles. What a passage loaded with meaning, which I'm going to unpack. Rome has some spiritual authority, I infer from this, keywords infer, to forbid Ignatius and to perhaps pull some strings to stay the execution. Well, why? Well, most of the letters, in fact, are a request to be martyred, unlike other letters where Ignatius takes it upon himself to teach the other churches, and in fact, lording his authority over them. Now, the way Ignatius goes about this could be quite assertive, like we see in chapters 7 and 8. He really tries to dissuade them from staying his execution. Because remember, this is what happened to St. Paul. He was in Rome once, and his execution was stayed, and then he went to Spain, then he went back to Rome to be executed. So I think the way Ignatius goes about this, by conceding Rome's teaching and Eucharistic authority, and then stating he can merely request that Rome does what he asks, even if his request is assertive, like we see in chapter 7 and 8, this implies Rome's spiritual authority. You don't say, I can't lord something over you, if in some sense they can lord something over you. This is, to me, pretty plain in Ignatius' letter to the Romans. Now, Rome's authority also, which is very important, is sourced by the apostles Peter and Paul. This is not some sort of late idea. We see this plain in the letter of Romans in the passage I just read. Now, Romans chapter 9. Remember in your prayers the church in Syria, which now has God for its shepherd instead of me. Jesus Christ alone will oversee it, and your love. What does this mean? What is your love? Well, if we look at it again in the literal Greek, it says Jesus Christ, and then it says bishops. It's Episcopacy. It's in Greek. I can't pronounce it. It says bishops and your love feast. So literally says that the or your love feast, meaning the singular love feast in Rome, is now amongst the bishops with Jesus Christ. It's kind of awkward here, but love feast here is a word for the Roman Synod, which taken literally, Ignatius says, now is spiritual authority in Antioch in his absence. Now, the term agape is not genitive here, which implies a reference to agapes in chapter 1 is to a body of churches, while agape here is to the local church of Rome. Now, if you go, well, you're pulling too much from this. Well, let's look at a very similar passage of Polycarp chapter 1. Now, Ignatius writes there, Polycarp, bishop of the church of the Smyrnans, or rather who has as his own bishop God the Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. So as we could see in the theology of Ignatius, the bishop in any local church is really God. The vicar is the man, right? So in Smyrna, that vicar is Polycarp. But who is the vicar in Antioch's absence, in his absence from Antioch? The Roman Synod. When have you heard this in any sort of apologetics or even history of this topic? And to me, this is very plain in Ignatius' writing. So from this, I believe we could rightly infer patriarchal hierarchy, Rome being above Antioch. How does Rome become the stand-in in his absence? So I think patriarchal hierarchy, like we see in later canons, this is not some sort of late Roman invention as part of political stuff. This is decades after the scriptures were written. This already existed, just the term patriarchate didn't exist. Now, in Ignatius writes in Polycarp chapter 2-4, where in such a sense to dictate the Polycarp. Like Polycarp's an associate of St. John, but St. Polycarp is dictated to by St. Ignatius. So I believe we can rightly infer this is perhaps due to Antioch being a senior patriarchate, so to say. Like Antioch's above Smyrna on the pecking order, just like Rome's above Antioch in the pecking order. So yet, despite all the stuff, you're like, wait, isn't Craig Orthodox? It sounds very like, this is beyond what a papal apologist will say. Again, we got to cover the history here. Rome was not the only one to have a say in Ignatius' absence. In Polycarp chapter 7, it indicates that Polycarp is instructed to send an assistant, perhaps a locum tenens, to Antioch. It says, O Polycarp, most blessed in God, to assemble a very solemn council and to elect one whom you greatly love, bestow on him this honor that he may go into Syria. So chapter 8 then tasked Polycarp with requesting other churches. So Polycarp said, hey, Polycarp, ask other churches to do the same. Perhaps to replace or assist a persecuted episcopate. So what's going on here? Canon 2 of Constantinople I allows foreign bishops to partake in ordinations in a different territory with permission. So perhaps Ignatius was reacting to a harsh persecution and felt that Smyrna and Rome would be able to help reconstitute a devastated Antiochian church. He was giving their permission to do valid ordinations in his territory in his absence. Now, before this synod in Lebanon and Syria met, perhaps spiritual authority would reside in the resting place of Peter and Paul, because Antioch's a Petrine church, and that would be Rome. So that's why it kind of makes sense where he said the love feast in Rome would be the bishop after Jesus Christ. Now, some are going to say, wrongly, that this is just an honorific, all right? And it's not. Ignatius did not use empty honorifics. When he specifically employs honorifics, he does so often in reference to something well-known. Example, Ephesians 1, Ignatius' letter to Ephesians. He says, to the church which is at Ephesus in Asia, deservedly most happy, being blessed in the greatness and fullness of God the Father, and predestinated before the ages of time, that it should be always for an enduring, unchangeable glory, being united and elected through the true passion by the will of the Father. Guys, this is an obvious reference to Ephesians 1. So he's giving honorifics to Ephesus, that they're predestinated, that they're elect. But these are exact words from Ephesians chapter 1. He didn't say these things coincidentally. In Philadelphians chapter 1, Ignatius writes, to the church of God the Father and our Lord Jesus Christ, which is at Philadelphia in Asia, which has obtained mercy and is established in the harmony of God and rejoices unceasingly in the passion of our Lord and is filled with all mercy through his resurrection. Well, what's he referencing? Revelation 3:10. Because you have kept my command to persevere, I also will keep you from the hour of trial which shall come upon the whole world, right? Which has obtained mercy to test those who dwell on the earth. How about Smyrna's chapter 1, right? That's Polycarp's church. The church of God, which has through mercy obtained every kind of gift, which is filled with faith and love, and is deficient in no gift, most worthy of God, adorned with holiness. The church which is at Smyrna in Asia. So interestingly, this has no relation to Revelation 2:8-11, which is some unchoice words about Smyrna. But Polycarp is their bishop, so having an apostolic father as their bishop may have been perceived as an exceptional honor, hence that honorific, deficient in no gift. Now, lesser churches, by the way, like in Magnesians and Trallians chapter 1, they don't have any honorifics. You guys can read it yourself, we got to save time, but they just lack honorifics. So therefore, any honorific about Rome must be understood as acknowledging something important. If they preside or primate over the love feast, that's not something random. He didn't write the beginning of Smyrna's random, Philadelphia randomly, Ephesians randomly. It has meaning, and that's why I believe we're justified to infer the things we were inferring earlier. Now, before ending this topic, let me make a couple more points. There's an interesting passage with implications perhaps against papal infallibility. In Romans chapter 7, he writes, the prince of this world would fain to carry me away and corrupt my disposition towards God, i.e. martyrdom. Let none of you, therefore, who are in Rome, help him, as in Satan. So we don't see any notion of infallibility or indefectibility there. But again, it's kind of anachronistic to infer Vatican I distinctions at this juncture. He's just simply saying that Satan could deceive Rome to do the wrong thing, and so he's using strong wording, perhaps this exaggeration, to make it seem really scandalous to stop him from being executed. He wanted his martyrdom. He didn't want any strings pulled to cancel his execution. Romans also lacks reference to an individual bishop like Philadelphians and some of the other letters, and details about the Episcopacy, but I think this is for two reasons. One, there's no schism in the Roman Church, unlike some of those other letters where these things are referenced. And also, he doesn't have teaching authority over Rome, that Ignatius, even though he taught everywhere else about ecclesiology, he couldn't take it upon himself to teach Rome about ecclesiology. And that's not my opinion, that's what Ignatius actually says. So let me just now summarize all this stuff, because I'm sure people have not heard Ignatius covered in this way before. The Ignatian Corpus not only establishes the ubiquitous nature of the monoepiscopacy, it also establishes that mere decades after the scriptures An internal hierarchical nature of the church predicated upon the location apostolic relics was presumed upon. This not only deconstructs Protestant presuppositions that these are developments, they claim, but also popular, sadly, Orthodox ones, that Rome is totally equal to other churches. The term patriarchate and pentarchy is not in use, but its eternal logic is clearly already at work, with Rome at the head. A precedent to Canon 2 of Constantinople I is clearly seen in Ignatius' directions to Polycarp. Any reference that Rome lacked a singular pope, simply because he's not named, is an argument from silence. It is possible Rome was between popes, as Cyprian centuries later would write to the entire Roman Synod before the new pope, Cornelius, for example, was elected. Additionally, it requires presuming that the occasion for each Ignatian letter is identical, which is clearly not the case, as there is no evidence in Romans that there's a schism in Romans, like we see in some of the other churches he's writing to. The occasion is for Ignatius to dissuade them from preventing his execution, something that likely happened with Paul in his first go-around in Rome, and in being so assertive to demand this, he must be deferential, thereby revealing Rome's spiritual preeminence even above his own. And remember, he's the bishop of Antioch. It is not clear if Antioch viewed itself as under local Roman jurisdiction, or that this spiritual authority is viewed as church-wide, or is this universal jurisdiction as later Roman Catholics would interpret it. Nevertheless, until a new bishop in Antioch was elected, Rome inherited the Antiochian church, if we take Ignatius at his words. So I'm sorry, because I know I went a while there, John, but I figure I'm just going to cover a lot of the bases you were going to cover. So let me give the floor to you and take the time you need to discuss Ignatius on this issue of the papacy.
Okay, thank you. I'll be very brief compared to that, and I may ask you to let me make up some of that time when we get to the Paschal controversy, because then there's going to be a lot of things I'm going to have to bring up.
Sure.
So I appreciate that. So thank you. There's very little I would really find objectionable in what you said. It would not rise to the level of something I would need to rebut, not that this is even a debate. So much of that I would agree with, or so I'm just going to add a few things here. First of all, St. Ignatius, by tradition, is actually a successor of St. Peter. By tradition, he's considered the third bishop of Antioch. Peter considered as the first. Then after him, somebody named St. Evodius. And then in the third place, Ignatius. Mm-hmm. So he could legitimately claim to be a successor of Peter in some sense, meaning in an episcopal line, not having a kind of special powers or special powers of binding and loosing that the Pope has always claimed. Antioch later on was known as both a Petrine see and a patriarchal see. We actually have, by tradition, a Feast of the Chair of Peter at Antioch, which may be older than the Feast of the Chair at Rome, since it is mentioned as early as the Liberian Catalog, which is in the 4th century. All right. With many of you, I would even celebrate in common a feast day of St. Ignatius on February 1st. And of course, we all celebrate in common the feast of Saints Peter and Paul on June 29th. Now, I'm traditional Catholic. June 29th is actually a very big day because it used to be a day where you would have a lot of ordinations in the traditional rite due to some things that happened after Vatican II. Now, get into the text here. He talks about Rome as presiding, and some translations talk about Rome having a presidency of love. I've heard that translation, but when you look at the Greek, the verb is actually in the participle. So I apologize, I did not learn modern Greek pronunciation. So the participle is prokathemene tes agapes. That's more like presiding. Okay, that's clearly a participle, presiding, and therefore some would translate this as presiding over love. Love can mean, of course, an agape, a love feast. I think you mentioned the synod. I think it's not a huge stretch even to consider it as a kind of word that's capable of representing the church itself. There's a range of different possible meanings, and that's all I'm trying to give here. So presiding over love is one translation. Okay, I'm just trying to give a range of linguistic meaning. I'm not going to make a dogma out of one word here. I think it's significant what the saint says in Romans 4. Not as Peter and Paul do I command you. They were apostles, I am a convict. They were free, I am a slave even now. And this is a big deal. First of all, we have these polemical books like Denny, which I see cited a lot. He tries to call into question whether St. Peter is the first bishop of Rome. I've already covered a lot of that evidence in the last program. His fathers are very clear about St. Peter holding the sacerdotal chair, some even say for 25 years. We talked about that. Sacerdotal here is clearly it's not a presbyteral chair. It's not a chair of a simple priest. It's clearly a sacerdotal equivalent to episcopal chair. So these objurgatory comments by Denny are basically nugatory when you look at the patristics. Not as Peter and Paul do I command you. He takes it for granted that St. Peter and Paul commanded. Now, the Roman, notice he disclaims the ability to do such a thing. St. Ignatius, although a successor of Peter in the episcopal line, says very humbly, not as Peter and Paul do I command you. Now, we're going to see in this very program, it's going to be quite different for the bishops of Rome, because they will do that. In fact, they will sometimes invoke the apostolic authority of both Saints Peter and Paul. And we're going to talk about St. Ireaneus. We already talked about St. Ireaneus, who talks about Peter and Paul being involved in the passing on of the episcopate, first to Linus, then to Cletus and St. Clement and the rest. We already talked about that. And so the Roman bishops will invoke the apostolic authority of Saints Peter and Paul. One of the most famous cases many centuries later will be the bull promulgating the Latin Mass for the whole Roman Patriarchate. This has a passage that if anybody contravenes these precepts, he will incur the wrath of the holy apostles Peter and Paul. Now, the Roman bishop only claims to be the successor of Peter, but they will invoke the apostolic authority of Peter and Paul. St. Ignatius does not do this. Okay? St. Ignatius, although Bishop of Antioch, which is a Petrine see and patriarchal see, explicitly disclaims that ability. Now, another important point is in Romans 3, which you've already mentioned. The saint says, you never envied anyone, you have taught others. My will is that what you have enjoined, that's commanded, and tello in Greek, what you have commanded or enjoined in teaching may stand firm. You had a slightly different translation, but the basic idea is clear. Rome has taught others, and the saint's wish is that what Rome has enjoined or commanded in the course of teaching may be respected or hold firm. All right? Once again, that's something the saint does not attempt to do here. All he really attempts to do is to say, please don't interfere with my martyrdom, basically. Let me go and give my life for Christ, is what he asks. Please don't interfere. And then finally, St. Ignatius knows that if he is martyred, then the church in Syria will be orphaned or without a chief shepherd. So he writes, remember in your prayers the church in Syria, which in my place has God for her shepherd. Jesus Christ alone shall act as her bishop and your love. Now that's the translation I used for the verb episcopacy, which is to oversee. But that word episcopein in Greek is the derivation of the word bishop. So to oversee is to act as bishop. You could even say to episcopize. Now, I would not use that for profane text, but we're talking about the church here. We're in a church or Christian context. When you talk about Jesus Christ will oversee, it can have that meaning of acting as bishop. Okay. Again, we're not trying to make dogmas from one word. I'm just trying to give you an idea of the range of meanings that one can find in these letters. And that's what we're doing here. This is why I say we're going into detail on these texts in a way that really has not been done before, as far as I know. Certainly not in popular apologetics such as one finds on YouTube. So that's what St. Ignatius says. My will is that what you have enjoined or commanded and tello in teaching others may hold firm or be respected. Now, that's what he said at the beginning of the 2nd century, coming right out of the apostolic age. We're going to be talking about the Paschal controversy, where another bishop of the East took a very different attitude towards what Rome enjoined in teaching, but that will be for later. Okay, I want to add one final point since I took so little time. St. Ignatius in Smyrnians talks for the first time about the Catholic Church. Now, this is the proper name of the church. It's the name of the church, the only name one finds in the Creed. Catholic Church, Holy Catholic Church, one Holy Catholic Apostolic Church. I will defend the ancient usage of referring to the true church as the Orthodox Church. I know that holy men have engaged in this usage. So yes, I'll defend it, but it's not the most correct or ancient name for the true church. The most ancient name since the times of the Apostolic Fathers, the name in the creeds, is the Catholic Church. So with that, and reserving whatever time I'm still entitled to for the Paschal controversy, Greg, I think I'll turn it right back to you.
Well, I think we both went over, so... So what we'll do is, how about it's going to still be with you? You're going to perhaps briefly go over the Shepherd Hermas and the alleged plural Episcopacy. So how about you cover that topic first, and don't feel obliged to use a lot of time, because it certainly is it's less dense than what we were just covering. So, John, you start again.
Okay, great. There's very little to add here, but we'll talk a little bit. So, Hermas, his claim to fame, so to speak, is writing this book called Shepherd of Hermas, which is highly valued by some church fathers. Some thought it should be in the canon. It's not. First time I read it more than 40 years ago, probably before many of you were born. I read it again for this program, studied it. He does talk about elders ruling the church, but what I found in Eusebius, Book 5, is that Eusebius of Caesarea, which we're going to talk about as well, he is actually referring to the bishops of Rome. He's referring to those men who are well known as appearing on the episcopal list, the list of the bishops, but he sometimes calls them the elders. So therefore, this talk about elders or presbyters ruling the Church of Rome should have been taken with a grain of salt. It in no way contradicts what we know about the ancient episcopal lists of those bishops who ruled the Roman Church. So the only other thing to add is the interesting coincidence that he was the brother of the Pope.
Yeah.
Hermas was the brother of the Bishop Pius I, who was Bishop of Rome about 140 to 155. So it happens to put a little flesh and blood on the person of the Pope as a real person with a real family, with a real brother. Some of this is mentioned in another ancient document called the Muratorian Canon, which was published in the 17th century. But I have nothing, I mean, there's nothing I see that suggests that the Church of Rome was ruled by anything other than the bishop's name by tradition, including Ireaeneus, Liberian Catalog, the Roman diptychs, and the rest. So I don't want to lose any more time here. So, Craig, I'll turn that over to you if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I'm going to add very little on this topic as well. And so those are where Shepherd 2:4-8 and Shepherd 3:9-7 speaks of, like, thou shalt read the book to this city along with the elders that preside over the church. Now, therefore I say unto you that they're rulers of the church and that occupy the chief seats. So a lot of liberal and Protestant scholarship will say, they'll infer, all right, keywords infer, that each city, including Rome, had multiple elders or rulers occupying multiple chief seats, and that they're functionally equivalent. Now, where and what we just read said they were functionally equivalent. This is clearly an inference. It's not explicitly in the evidence. And what's so ironic, as John pointed out in the Muratorian fragment, it explicitly says, Hermas wrote the shepherd very recently in our times in the city of Rome while Bishop Pius, his brother, was occupying the chair of the church of the city of Rome. So Pius was bishop of Rome about around 154. The Muratorian fragment is between 170 to 200. So if we went in the middle, it'd be 185. So 30 years from the writing of the Shepherd of Hermas, they knew who wrote it and they knew who his brother was. And if you know the brother was Pope, then there's just one Pope. It's kind of odd that we know explicitly there was one Pope at the time it was written in a very early source, but we're going to infer that there's multiple rules in church that are functionally equivalent where it doesn't say that whatsoever in the source. Now, what do, as John has alluded to, contemporary sources say about the Bishop of Rome? It's not that we don't have a good amount of them in the 2nd, 3rd century. There's a fragment of Hegesippus, and he wrote this sometime after the year 189 AD. And he said, the Corinthian church continued in the true doctrine until Primus became bishop. On my arrival at Rome, I drew up a listed succession of bishops down to Anicetus, approximately 160 AD, whose deacon was Eleutherius. To Anicetus succeeded Soter, approximately 174 AD, and after him Eleutherus, approximately 189 AD. But in the case of every succession, and in every city, the state's affairs in accordance to the teaching of the law and the prophets and of the Lord. So we have someone from the 2nd century who gives succession of the Bishop of Rome, and he names just a singular Bishop of Rome. Now, we have another source from Dionysius of Corinth, who wrote in the 170s. He says, you Romans, keep up the custom of the Romans handed down by the fathers, which your blessed Bishop Soter, year 174, has not only preserved, but added to. So Soter's still alive when this is written. Sending to splendid gifts to the saints, and exhorting with blessed words those brethren who go up to Rome as an affectionate father his children. So as you can see, this is very specific and personal, right? He's not naming one bishop of Rome because it's some sort of like made-up idea that came up late 2nd century. It's something that he was well aware of. And it also shows this is an antecedent to the title Pope, which just means father. For even those not local to Rome, he calls him an affectionate father. So people make too much of, Pope's a later name and title, which is sort of true, but the idea is not. The idea is here in Dionysius of Corinth. St. Ireaeneus, he was in Rome in the 170s. He likewise makes a very identical succession list, and other earlier lists from Julius Africanus, Tertullian, Hippolytus are almost exactly the same. They wrote these by the early 3rd century, the latest. So for those who infer a plural episcopacy, this inference requires that there was mass amnesia in Julius Africanus, in Tertullian, in Hippolytus, in Ireaeus, in Dionysius of Corinth, in Hegesippus. Am I forgetting anyone? At least 6 sources. One of them knowing who the brother of the writer of the Shepherd Hermas was. It's just too crazy. It's easy enough to infer that there was a pope and several core bishops, as we covered in the previous episode. We have explicit evidence that there was a singular pope and there were in the existence of core bishops, but we have no explicit evidence of a plural episcopacy. I think it's safest for us to interpret the evidence by what we have that's explicit, not draw inferences that all these core bishops in the Bishop of Rome were essentially equivalent when just no one says that. All right, so that's enough on the Shepherd of Hermas. Being that John went first on the Shepherd of Hermas, now I'm going to go first on Ireaneus against Heresies chapter 3, and then John will come after me. Now, in Against Heresies chapter 3, it's important to start, I think, before that, in chapter 1, paragraph 1, where he says, Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome and laying the foundations of the church. So as we're going to see unfold, even somewhat against some of the presentation I've already gave, Ireaeus doesn't really focus on the charism of Rome. He focuses on the preaching, the teaching of Rome, and that being the foundation. We're going to get into why in a moment. Now I want to read the passage that everyone argues about in chapter 3, paragraph 2. Ireaeus writes, "It would be very tedious in such a volume as this to reckon up the successions of all the churches. We do put to confusion all those who assemble in unauthorized meetings." Then it says, by indicating that tradition derived from the apostles. But I think it's a good inference we could draw from all the translations they put in brackets. We can avoid confusion, I would say, by indicating that tradition derived from the apostles of the very great, the very ancient, and universally known church founded and organized at Rome by the two most glorious apostles, Peter and Paul, as also the faith preached to men, which comes down to our time by means of the successions of the bishops. The faith comes down by succession. For it is a matter of necessity that every church should agree with this church, that is Rome, on account of its preeminent authority, that is the faithful everywhere, inasmuch as the apostolical tradition has been preserved continuously by those who exist everywhere. And that's the translation from the Ante-Nicene Fathers collection. In other words, to avoid confusion that may result from listing all the church's successions, Ireaeus picks Rome because of their preeminent authority, which he then defines to be the fact that they preserve the same faith found everywhere. Now, how does he know that they have the same faith that everywhere else has? I'm going to cover this more in a bit. This passage is not, as I said, about Rome's ecclesiastical prerogatives, but them serving as a prominent example of the historicity of Orthodox doctrine vis-a-vis the Gnostic doctrines. Let's unpack this. Now, in chapter 3, verse 2 of Against Heresies, book 3, he talks about the very ancient, universally known church founded and organized at Rome by the two most glorious apostles, Peter and Paul. So though Ireaeus would not be unaware of the importance of their relics, he is not appealing to a charism. This actually surprises me, from Rome being their successors. Now, why does this surprise me? Because this would have been a smoking gun against the Gnostics, right? You know, there's this charism, Peter and Paul, they got a teaching authority from this charism, it would settle the issue. But I think that polemically, such a charism would have been viewed as useless because the Gnostics would have claimed their own secret charisms. So Ireaeus focused on establishing the historicity of Orthodox theological claims. So he was emphasizing origins vis-a-vis literal ecclesiastical authority. Now, my translation to literal Latin, I ran this by John, so it's, John can then correct me and when he gives his time, poked around this a little bit. But when I read the Latin, this is what I've come up with. For to this church, that's Rome, on account of its preeminent authority, it is necessary for the church, ecclesium, the singular, the church, to agree, conveniere, that is, to those who are faithful from every side, undique, in which the tradition of the apostles has always been preserved by those who are from every side, undique. Undique is the same Latin word. I don't know how to pronounce it. Now, the church must be a reference to Rome. That's singular. The passage appears to state that due to Rome's authority, it is necessary for the Roman church to agree with itself. Now, how? That sounds odd. Well, the statement emphasizes Rome's authority attained via Peter and Paul, in that all the faithful from everywhere concur or preserve the same tradition as already found in Rome. From the Latin, I infer from every side instead of the faithful everywhere like we saw in the Ante-Nicene Fathers, as I think the former is the more literal translation of conveniere. All right, so from every side. The former also indicates that the faithful from throughout the world are in Rome. That's the inference that would demand. These people validate Rome's doctrine, giving it preeminent, deserved, or attained authority. Now, this means that Rome is not preeminent merely because of its own preserving of the tradition of Peter and Paul, as such a charism would not impress the Gnostics. Rather, its preservation is validated by Christians throughout the world going to this church and preserving the same doctrine because they're actually there. Hence, if a Gnostic claimed that Rome has corrupted the tradition, as they would, Ireaneus would not have to name Alexandria and Ephesus and wherever else it agrees and likewise list their pedigrees, because this would be tedious and confusing, as Ireaneus says. By just naming Rome and giving their pedigree and pointing to the fact that Christians from all these other places go to Rome and teach and agree with her teachings, Rome's faith alone vis-a-vis the Gnostics would be sufficient in countering any claim that the historical faith was Gnostic instead of Proto-Orthodox, because Rome itself exhibits a universal faith. Everyone from everywhere agrees with them. So in short, if one proves Rome's apostolic succession due to everyone agreeing with them, this demonstrates the historicity of the faith preserved by their succession. Ireaeus does not emphasize ecclesiastical authority. Those who will say preeminent authority and infer that, it's just an inference. It's actually not the explanation he gives. As we shall find out when we talk about the Paschal controversy, Ireaeus actually inveighed against unilateral Roman ecclesiastical authority during the Paschal controversy. So I believe the interpretation that's given here works better with what Ireaeus actually states there, and also works better with what we know from Ireaeus elsewhere. And with that, I'm going to now hand the microphone over to John.
Okay, Craig, thank you. So apart from what you said about the Paschal controversy, where we disagreed as expected, there's really almost nothing you said that I would take much of an issue with. As a matter of fact, I basically agree with your general reasoning, and I think the translation you're giving is quite fair, but I'm going to do a little bit of linguistic analysis so people can see what we're really looking at here, going beyond translation. So, first of all, St. Ireaeus has to refute the idea that the apostles taught some sort of secret gnosis. And, of course, he's going to try to show the apostles didn't teach any differently than their successors, who are the bishops. And he says openly, the apostles left to their successors, that's the bishops, their own place of teaching authority, which, when I looked it up in the Latin version, is suum ipsorum locum magisterii. Locum magisterii, place of teaching authority, PG 7, 848. Some of these passages have not survived in the original Greek, including the famous one about Rome. So we're looking at a text where we can't prove empirically what the saint said because we don't have the original Greek. We have a translation in Latin that some have called barbarous. So we're, sounds like we're a bit behind the eight ball here. We're trying to determine exactly what he meant. But luckily, the context is fairly clear. So he's basically saying here that I could list all of the successions in the apostolic churches. That would take a long time. It's a lot simpler just to list the succession in the Roman church. The other churches are going to agree with it anyway because of its greater authority, or as you have the translation, preeminent authority. Now, I'm just going to examine the Latin that survived as a translation. So we have two verbs that could change the meaning, or two terms, I should say. One of them is convenire. So this translation talks about convenire. Now, the word convenire can mean to agree, or it can mean literally to convene somewhere, to meet, come together. since this is a barbarous translation, I don't know it's going to be a lot of help to look at the, more classical dictionary, So, but there are those two different meanings. So every church must convene somehow at Rome, or every church must agree with the Roman Church. Those are two possible meanings based on conveneering. Now, the other one is the word he uses, principality. And this one is a fascinating one because this word is related by its roots in Latin to a word for origin, principium, or a word for authority. Okay, just as we talk about principalities as authorities. All right, we have the principalities and powers. Rome, the bishops of Rome will sometimes use the word principality for their own authority. So, which is it? Is it origin or authority he's talking about? Now, more likely the meaning is authority, which is the meaning which you gave in the translation you cited. And the reason why I say that is because of the other words around it. He talks about, in the surviving Latin translation, the other churches must agree with Rome because, in Latin, propter potentiorum principalitatem, because of the more powerful principality. So that word, more powerful, potentiorum, indicates authority rather than origin. And then we have another variant in Latin text, which I've seen, which is propter potiorum principalitatem. Again, that means either greater or stronger. So because of the greater principality or stronger principality. So Rome has a greater, stronger, or more powerful principality. Now that's based on the Latin translation. Okay, so I'm not trying to, prove more than I should. I'm just saying these are the range. This is the range of possible meanings based on the Latin. Okay, I want to add here that Saint Ireaneus, as I already said, talks about how the apostles left to their successors their own place of teaching authority, locum magisterii. I'm going to have to come back to that. This telltale reference from the saint when we talk about the Paschal controversy, which I'm about ready to go to anyway. So I'll give it back to you and reserve my time for the controversy.
Well, guess what? You get to start the Paschal controversy, John. So how about you get right into it?
So be it. Okay, so the Paschal controversy is something we have from a couple of different sources. Basically, there was a tradition, probably apostolic, probably from Saints John and Philip, of celebrating the Pascha or Easter on the Hebrew day, 14th Nisan. But in Rome, it was, and actually almost everywhere else, it was the custom to celebrate it on a Sunday, as we do today, all of us. I mean, nobody celebrates on 14th Nisan. So this had become a controversy. And what happened is that it was in the late 2nd century, Pope Victor, after some earlier efforts by his predecessors to try to enforce a Sunday celebration uniformly, had a consultation with Alexandria. And this is mentioned in the Alexandrian Synaxarion. It's mentioned in the Coptic 10 Hatur, which is November 6th for us. And I've looked it up both in I looked up in the Patrologia Orientalis version, PO 3275, anybody wants to look at it. So he learned from Alexandria, according to this, the proper way to compute the Easter or Paschal celebration on Sunday. He was very happy with it, held a synod, and there are other synods held. We also have, of course, Eusebius of Caesarea, Church History, Book 5, talks about this. Synods were held almost everywhere. Almost everybody agreed and drew up decrees that it should be on Sunday, except for one faction led by a bishop named Polycrates of Ephesus, but the historians say it's mostly Asia Minor, or Asia, as they say, that insisted on this 14th Nisan date, basically the Jewish date, or the Old Testament date. Now, I think most of us know what happened, is that according to Eusebius, Pope Victor either tempted or actually wrote letters cutting off or excommunicating the churches that kept up to this practice. We call it quartodeciman, where that just means 14th. Okay, so the quartodecimans were those who celebrated the Pascha on 14th Nisan. So he either attempted or did cut them off from unity, and then St. Ireaneus came in, according to Eusebius, and Eusebius gives different versions, uses different phrases. He rebuked Victor, or she talks about some of the bishops sharply rebuked Victor. But the only one he really quotes here is St. Ireaneus, and he says he suitably exhorts him. So he quotes some words from Ireaneus exhorting him, but basically saying, look, we don't want to cut off entire churches here. Now, that's what we get out of Eusebius. Okay? I got to tell you, I don't think Eusebius is lying, but we got to be a little careful here. Eusebius is highly suspicious of heterodoxy to the Seventh Ecumenical Council. And I suggest that we have the translation now from Father Price. People can read it for themselves. So you want to take something from Eusebius, that's fine. I say, as President Reagan used to say, trust but verify. We have a more orthodox source in somebody named St. Anatolius, Bishop of Laodicea, in the 3rd century, writing half a century after the controversy. And what he says is pretty simple. His book is called Paschal Canon. I actually looked it in the Greek, PG 10-17, but it's also translated online. And he just says simply that the Bishop of Asia were celebrating Pascha on the 14th day of the month, that's Nisan, not acquiescing to the authority of some, that is, the successors of Peter and Paul. Therefore, contention arose between some of their successors, namely Victor, Bishop of Rome, and Polycrates. That's from St. Anatolius. Thank you, St. Anatolius. You passed the test with flying colors. Now, we need to know the final history of this, since we have this confrontation between Rome and an Eastern bishop. So what happens? Well, for the moment, St. Ireaeus with his counsels of peacemaking prevails, so there's no excommunication. That's what Eusebius says, and that's also what Anatolius says. But later on, we find out that the Council of Arles takes up this matter and says, Canon 1, very first canon, Pascha is going to be on a Sunday. The Bishop of Rome will name the day by custom and indicate it by letter. We also have the Council of Nicaea, which of course also decrees that Easter should be on a Sunday, but that decree I think has been lost. And St. Ireaeus was correct that this issue could be resolved without a major schism. History does bear that out and say he was right about that. And even Pope Victor went along with him on that point. But there was a schism of sorts because the last stragglers coming in from this schism came in at the Council of Ephesus, or maybe just before the Council of Ephesus. And unfortunately, the bishop there was somebody named Nestorius, who was, of course, a heresiarch in his own right, maybe a far worse heretic than these quartodecimans ever could have been. He, of course, was destined to be anathematized. And he has them sign a creed at their reconciliation written up by another heresiarch, Theodore of Mopsuestia. So we have the issue here. Did this resistance to Rome lead to schism and heresy, or is this idea a false talking point made up by the Roman Catholics? I give you the facts tonight. You judge. Let the audience judge. These are very intelligent people. I gave the facts and the patristics. Now, I'm going to give some interpretation here to maybe explain why Pope Victor might have reacted so excessively. And I'll just do it under the guise of an umpire calling balls and strikes. So the first point is from St. Anatolius of Laodicea. His words, literally, not acquiescing to the successors of Peter and Paul. Strike one. And then another issue is that Polycrates of Ephesus was going against synodality itself, because the synods of most of the world were publishing decrees that the Pascha should be on Sunday. So he's going against synodality. Strike two. He alleges a divine command to do what he was doing when he says we must obey God rather than men, referring to the bishop, especially of Rome, as one would refer to the heathen or the publican. Strike three. But he wasn't finished. Some batters don't know when they've struck out. They have to be ejected from the game. He takes the words that St. Peter said to the Pharisees and turns them against the very men to whom St. Peter handed down his ministry. That would have been strike four, not needed. Even though the resurrection is the reason why our Sabbath is transferred to Sunday, the resurrection is the one thing he refuses to celebrate on Sunday. That would be a fifth strike. And, of course, he leads at least some of he stops at the brink of schism, but there is a schism later on. And the last stragglers come in the fifth century. That would have been strike six, based on his responsibility for the arguments he made. They come in under Nestorius, and the result is, as I said, this is in the Acts of the Council of Ephesus, where they come in and they sign this bogus creed, which is believed to be from Theodore of Mopsuestia. All of this was unnecessary, and the reason for it is given by St. Anatolius, an Orthodox bishop, in his words, not acquiescing to the authority of the successors of Peter and Paul. All right? Those strikes are my interpretation, of course, but I think it's very likely that Pope Victor was thinking along the same lines. So there's not a whole lot I need to add here. So, Craig, I'll just turn that right over to you.
All right. Well, hold on to your seat, and everyone else hold on to their seats. I'm going to give a brief overview of the Pascha controversy from Eusebius, the chronology, and I'm going to, being that we both had these interpretations, we had the balls and strikes, just strikes I heard from John, I'll then do the same. Now, the historical episode is recorded as follows. 1. Asia Minor held to Pascha on Saturday, as we see in Eusebius, Church History, Book 5, Chapter 23, verse 1. All right, the rest of the world, quoting Eusebius, didn't, as we see in the same passage. 3. Synods and assemblies, quoting Eusebius, of bishops were held on this account, as we see in the very next verse, 23:2. 4. Quoting Eusebius, all with one consent through mutual correspondence drew up an ecclesiastical decree. That's in the same passage. Ironically, this is a crypto-ecumenical council via local synods sharing decrees, forging a consensus. Now, Eusebius lists councils in Palestine, Rome, which bears the name of Victor, to quote him, Pontus, Gaul, Oshoni, which is like Eastern Turkey or like Greater Armenia, Corinth, same chapter, and Alexandria, as it mentions in chapter 25, verse 2. Now, almost the whole Pentarchy, other than, perhaps Ephesus, which was probably a jurisdiction over Byzantium, and Antioch, which was perhaps vacant this time, are covered. So this is pretty representative collection of local councils in the church. Now, 5. Ephesus rejected the world's decrees. In a letter, now this is important, quoting 24:1, addressed to Victor and the Church of Rome, not to the other churches, to Victor and the Church of Rome. 6, Victor responded to this letter, particularly, and the quote Eusebius attempted to cut off from the common unity the Ephesian church. How did he attempt? Well, more on this in a bit. That's 24:9. Now, 7a, I'm going to say we're going to go 7 in a couple steps. 7, this did not please all the bishops, according to Eusebius. Words of theirs are extant, sharply rebuking Victor. That's verse 10 and 24. Verse 11 and 24. Ireaneus sending letters, plural, in the name of the brethren of Gaul, that means as in several synodical documents, there's more than one synod held in Gaul apparently, reiterating the date of Pascha, but also, put in quotations, fittingly admonishes Victors that he should not cut off, the quote Eusebius, the Ephesian church, as we've seen 24:11. So cut off from whom? Now people infer, keyword infer, from the whole church, but this is not explicitly stated in Eusebius. These letters were sent both to Victor, according to Ireaeus' synodical letters, and also, to quote Eusebius, most of the other rulers of the churches in 24:18. So the proceeding is the entire timeline. There is no explicit evidence that Victor actually excommunicated the Ephesians, i.e. because this was attempted, nor that it was even perceived at the time that this was an exercise of universal jurisdiction or some claim to it, because these are inferences. It is simply not there in the sources. Now, historians treat these as justifiable inferences. I argue that such inferences are anachronistic, and I'm going to draw better inferences which make more use of the explicit historical evidence and offer a simpler explanation that an unsaid argument on universal jurisdiction occurred, because that's just not talked about. Now, first, premises. Orthodox and Catholics agree that 1, the bishopric is sourced from the Apostle Peter specifically. 2, the local jurisdiction of a church is determined by both provincial necessity, like along the lines of Roman geography, and who started a given church. Like churches started by Peter and Paul are part of the same local jurisdiction. We covered this in the last episode. 3, authority is traditionally given within a local jurisdiction to where the relics of a given apostle originally reside. So, i.e., Peter and Paul have a lot of churches, but their relics are Rome. James is in Jerusalem, Barnabas in Cyprus. Like the hagiographers say, Cyprus has autonomy or autocephaly because they found Barnabas relics there during Chalcedon, etc. Now 4, we understand that by church-wide consent, the bishoprics and relics can move or change location. For example, the bishopric of Jerusalem went to Alia almost right away after Jerusalem was destroyed. Constantinople increased in canonical importance, even though Andrew's relics were not there. He wasn't buried in Constantinople. There's the Avignon Papacy. The papacy wasn't even in the city of Rome. But again, if the church consents to this, it's not a big deal. We all have it. Now, I assert, now that we've discussed those premises, that Eusebius was discussing a dispute over local instead of universal jurisdiction. Here is my evidence. 1, the Ephesian Synod writes their letter to Rome specifically after all the synods made judgments on the date of Pascha, but before Victor attempted excommunicating them. All right? So they purposely picked a fight with Victor. They wrote a letter just to him. Why? We can only answer this question if we look at what they wrote to Rome and why Rome felt compelled to attempt excommunication. Now 2, in this letter, Ephesus asserts that the relics of the apostles Philip and John are in Asia Minor, Hierapolis and Ephesus respectively. 3 of Philip's daughters are supposedly in Ephesus. Martyrs Polycarp and Thrascius are in Smyrna. Sagaris is in Laodicea. Papirius and Mileto are in Sardis. Plus the relics of all Polycrates' relatives who are bishops are in Ephesus. He says this in 24:2-5. So as thus discussed beforehand, the importance of relics is that they delineate who the jurisdiction of a church belongs to. So why emphasize all these people's relics? In other words, by listing Philip, Polycarp, and other saints who had succession, presumably from John, Polycrates was likely asserting that they were a Johnine and Philippine church, not a Petrine and Pauline church. This is relevant because Paul started the church in Ephesus and stated and sent Timothy, presumably from Rome, as we see in Hebrews 11:23, to be bishop in Ephesus, like we've seen 1 Timothy 1:3 and 2 Timothy 4:12. So I read this as theoretically that Ephesus should have been under Rome's local jurisdiction, just like we have explicit evidence of this for Corinth in 1 Clement, as we covered in the last episode. Now, Acts of Timothy locates Timothy's death in Ephesus, and his relics were transferred from Ephesus to Constantinople in the mid-4th century. This day is commemorated by Eastern Oriental Orthodox alike. So it appears that the location of Timothy's relics were deliberately left out of the Ephesian letter. This cannot be by mistake. His relics were definitely there. We have good historical evidence of this. But for some reason, he lists everyone's relics, but not Timothy's. Why? Because naming Timothy's relics would substantiate that Paul sent Timothy there before his death, placing Ephesus under Rome's local jurisdiction. Now remember, the discussion of relics served the purpose of justifying Ephesus' independence from Rome, which is why they deliberately chose the names they did. Ephesus was probably the 3rd or 4th biggest city in the Roman Empire at the time, with significant political independence from Rome. So this appears to be a purposeful ecclesiastical shift in emphasis in tandem with Roman geographic lines, with the justification that the Apostle John's relics would have permitted them to do this. Now, Victor's response, my third point, is described as an attempted excommunication. Now, a universal jurisdictional inference would require that Eusebius was offering commentary against the existence of universal jurisdiction, and this is possible, but it also requires the inference of universal jurisdiction in the early 4th century, which I don't believe any primary source explicitly delineates, even up to the early 4th century, which John probably disagrees, but we will cover the centuries and we'll evaluate that ourselves. Now, a local jurisdictional inference makes sense with the comment. Victor attempted to excommunicate a diocese. He felt that was part of his proto-patriarchy. The reason he could not was because the world's churches recognized the claims of Ephesus being independent and not being under Rome's authority. This explains the connection between Ephesus' letter, starting with the discussion of relics, and then their ominous ending, quoting Acts 5:29. We ought to obey God rather than men. The Ephesians, in asserting their independence from Roman practice, were allegedly being obedient to the apostolic origin which is from God. Hence, the authority of their practice is derived from God, which is proved by the relics, because they said they got it from St. John, and not from man's, the Roman Synod's, permission. This is precisely why Rome attempted to excommunicate, because it was a means of demonstrating that their authority was from God, their relics were the relics of Ephesus, and that the Ephesians' claim was false. Now, just so people know, though this all makes some sort of ecclesiastical sense, that in my honest opinion, Rome was justified because Timothy's relics and the possible lack of Rome's acceptance to their independence would mean that really Rome had the right to excommunicate them, if you just want my humble opinion. But I could also see why the Ephesians may infer that John's relics transferred the apostolic pedigree from Peter and Paul. So they both have an argument. But there's a fourth point here, which I think it's always ignored in this conversation, which Ireaneus did not leave here by mistake. This is very important. They weren't talking about relics for the fun of it because they're quaint, stupid, old ancients. And they didn't say the following about St. Polycarp because they're quaint, stupid, old ancients. They understood the points at issue. Irenaeus' response to Victor communicates that, to quote Eusebius, which is quoting Irenaeus, when the blessed Polycarp was at Rome in the time of Pope Anicetus, and they disagreed a little, but, to quote Eusebius, they immediately made peace with one another. This is 24:16. It is stated that Polycarp cited the practice of John, so that's specific. We see that in the same verse. In the end, Anicetus conceded, the quote in this 24:17, Anicetus conceded the administration of the Eucharist in the church to Polycarp, manifestly as a mark of respect. I'm going to repeat this, because this is super important if you understand liturgics. Anicetus conceded the administration of the Eucharist in the church, which was at Rome, by the way, to Polycarp, manifestly as a mark of respect. So what's this show? This shows that Smyrna had earlier cited their Johannine authority, right? They said John gave us this practice. And when Rome conceded the administration of the Eucharist, Polycarp, not Pope Anicetus, presided over the liturgy, not Anicetus. In liturgics, only superiors or equals could preside over a liturgy. That's just basic liturgics. So if the Bishop of Rome was more than equal or above Polycarp, he couldn't have consented to this. So this may, keywords may, have been interpreted as an acknowledgement of Asia Minor's, or narrowly, Smyrna's independence, a sort of granting of proto-autocephaly. Okay? So Polycarp of Smyrna could claim that he had the right to this because lineage from John, but this precedent is pretty questionable for Polycrates, who's from Ephesus, which is why there's a controversy. But if Ireaneus refers to it, this means the incident and its importance was common knowledge. A century later, St. Anatolius of Laodicea, as John was mentioning the same saint, asserted that, and I'm quoting John's book, Keys, page 19, Polycrates appeared to have the primacy over the bishops of Asia, right? So perhaps Smyrna and Ephesus vied for regional primacy. So Polycrates may have been trying to claim the mantle of Polycarp, whose relics he makes mention in the letter. And by mentioning that he has his mantle, that's essentially like saying, well, then I have the same independence that you gave to Polycarp when he presided over the liturgy all those decades, a few decades previously. So in summary, the simplest interpretation of the Pascha controversy's relevance upon the papacy is not, despite all the stuff you heard, all the scholarship, all the stuff you're used to hearing, that the Pope was asserting universal jurisdiction over the church, or even that Eusebius and others were critiquing such an idea. Rather, Victor was responding to a letter purposely addressed to his synod and no one else's, which insultingly omitted any mention of Paul and of Timothy, and thereby Rome's importance in establishing the Ephesian church and its customs. Hence, the whole attempted excommunication details, fiasco rather, was jostling over who had local jurisdiction in Asia Minor. There are too many details supporting this explanation versus no details whatsoever supporting the universal jurisdictional inference. So that is my summary of the Paschal controversy. What we're going to do is maybe just give a brief overview of the century. I went last time, so I'll give my brief overview first. I'll be very brief because we already went over time. And then John will be given last words, and then we'll do plugs. So for the whole first episode, we saw there was very little disagreement over the facts. And in this episode, that's largely been the case. Now, where do the differences now start propping up? The differences start becoming apparent where our inferences are. As I said in the beginning, our inferences, right? We have the same explicit evidence of what happened during the Paschal controversy, but our inferences are very different. In Ignatius' letters, while nothing explicitly asserts universal jurisdiction, nothing rejects it. Rather, what is said pertains to Rome having some sort of spiritual authority over Antioch at minimum. So it's reasonable to infer universal jurisdiction. We got to draw inferences. That's the nature of history. But it's also reasonable to infer local jurisdiction with a sort of interjurisdictional primacy belonging to Rome. Now, I, as an Orthodox Christian, affirm the latter, not the former, and John will affirm the former, not the latter. Without a doubt, Rome has a special sort of authority and inheritance. Additionally, Peter, being the origin of the Episcopate, as we covered in the last episode, and his relics being in Rome, in some way subjugates those likewise who are successors of Peter in a broad sense and not simply in a Roman sense, other Petrine bishops. So they're subjugated to Roman authority in some spiritual way. We see this in Ignatius' letters to the Romans. Precisely what that authority is will unfold in future centuries. So we can't just infer whatever we want. We have to see what the saints explain, and what the historical evidence delineates is that authority. I want to challenge the audience not to simply infer universal jurisdiction all the time, because, like the instance of Pope Victor, that's not explicitly in the evidence. In fact, I think I have a better case. A better case could be made to infer, based on chronology and the emphasis on people-specific relics, that local jurisdiction was the point at issue. In the 2nd century, just one fragment. So, right, if we're going to go, well, we got to go with the explicit evidence we have. Our earliest explicit evidence about how Roman jurisdiction was viewed is from St. Dionysius of Corinth, and it's preserved for us in Book 2, Chapter 25, the Eusebius Church History. And he writes the following to Rome. So obviously not thinking he's insulting him. He says this, therefore you also have by admonition joined in close union the churches that were planted by Peter and Paul, that of the Romans and that of the Corinthians. For both of them went to our church and taught us in the same way as they taught you when they went to Italy, and having taught you, they suffered martyrdom at the same time. So as we could see, when we see, well, what's this prominence and importance of Rome? It's the union of churches that Peter and Paul, who died there, started. So that's not my inference. That's the only explicit reference to its significance that we have in the 1st and 2nd centuries. And not coincidentally, it's very much consistent with what we see in a 1st century source, 1 Clement chapter 1, where Clement says, we, in Rome, feel that we have been somewhat tardy in turning our attention to the points respecting which you, Corinth, consulted us. Right? So we actually see a flat-out appeal within this local union. We actually see explicit evidence of local jurisdiction. This is not some sort of, kind of way explain it away. So therefore, we have explicit evidence of unions, which I call local jurisdiction, existed between those churches, which belonged to a specific apostle or apostles, and we know how they functioned. This is not an inference. The simplest explanation is to interpret evidence consistently with what is most explicit. And that's what I want to challenge the listeners and viewers to do. So I will hold my peace. John, take your time to sum up the century and any closing thoughts, please.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we endeavored to give you the most substantive discussion of this topic that you have ever heard. And if you took that time tonight to listen, I don't think you should be disappointed. I'll be very brief in concluding remarks. Craig invited me on, because of course I'm going to always try to refer you back to the primary sources, but he also knows that in spite of our disagreements, I'm only here to talk about the tradition of the church, nothing else. The councils, the canons, the fathers, the liturgy. Expect nothing else from a dedicated traditional Catholic, and we should have this conversation. Now, some of you may be fans of a book called Two Paths by Michael Welton. And I agree, there are two paths. But they might be very different from the ones that Michael Welton thought they were. One, bishop in the 2nd century, early 2nd century, who knew the apostles, said, my will is that what you have enjoined in teaching may be respected. That, of course, is St. Ignatius to the Romans. But then at the end of the century, we have a bishop who says something quite different. We must obey God rather than men. And he was talking about his brother bishops, but most especially the bishops of the Roman Church. And so if you're here to discern tonight, you're Catholic, ex-Catholic, not sure, Protestant, discerning, maybe you no longer believe in sola scriptura, or you may be thinking, well, I'm narrowing it down to Catholic and Orthodox. Okay, whatever the case may be, both of us, for our side, did our utmost to help you discern the truth. Okay, two paths. Which one of these bishops led his flock in an apostolic manner? And which one led his flock onto the precipice of heresy and schism? Look, you're an intelligent audience. I can't do the syllogizing and concluding for you. God gave you intellect and free will. You'll discern all that for yourselves. All right? But my hope and my belief and my prayer, and also my promise, is to help you to do everything you possibly can, or everything I possibly can, to help you to discern the call from God to adhere to the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. And as I said before, I'm here to speak of the tradition of that church and nothing else. So I thank you so much for your time. I'm flattered you took time out to listen to what we had to say, and I hope you feel it was time well spent. Thanks again. Thank you, Craig.
Well, John, do you have any plugs that you'd like to refer people to, resources that may help them, or heck, you were kind enough to really help inform the audience, just whatever you'd like to plug.
Well, look, I hope you noticed that this was not the same old thing that you hear on other channels, the same old repetitive points. I hope you felt that you heard things you hadn't heard before. And if so, the reason for that is because I looked so deeply into the sources. I mean, talking about Mina, Mansi, CSCO, Petrologia Orientalis, and so forth. And I tried to give you everything I possibly could in co-authoring the book Keys Over the Christian World. I already told you it's been made a free download. We overlooked the copyright violation. It's being sold on the robertsongenis.org site. I will say he did an incredible job editing the book, turning the, basically paragraph footnotes into more proper endnotes and so on. So it's there if you want it. But everything we're going to do, everything in that book is there to speak only of the tradition of the church, as I did tonight. And also to give you sources you may not have heard before. So, like I said, if you're trying to discern, all right, you were a Protestant, but you see, it's not private interpretation. Polycarp couldn't go out and just found a Second Apostolic Church of Ephesus, or Second Catholic Church on the left, or Orthodox Church on the right. No, these are decided by apostolic authority. It's always been that way, and there has to be a ruling one way or another. They can't be left in ambiguity forever. If you want the fullness of that history I tried to give you, it's in Keys Over the Christian World. So I don't know what more I can give you. So it's out there for you.
Yeah, I quoted Keys Over the Christian World in my own presentation. It's a very valuable resource. It's going to become increasingly valuable as the centuries wear on, because there just becomes far more on that topic. You, John, and Scott Butler did good work, and I won't say more because you don't like people really talking about that, but it's a valuable resource. Guy is making it free for you he's making it free for you, so take advantage of the opportunity. If you want more updated translations, they've been tooling around on it for another 18 years or so. It's on the Robertson Genis website, and it's a valuable resource, which is why I endorse it, because I don't endorse something because it agrees everything I say. It's because I find it useful and has primary sources that are important, and quite frankly, it's one of the most impartial histories I've ever read. I mean, clearly we disagree, but it's written with a very neutral tone and has a lot of really good sources. It's a very good book. And so if that's blessed you, you could buy the book and, make John money, but he'd probably be just happy if you download it. But if this has blessed you from the Orthodox side, please go to orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate to help support the parishes in Cambodia. It's very important because they're cut off from much of the Russian funding, and if not all of it at this point due to the war in Ukraine. And there was a big push for donations. You, the audience, have been extremely generous when the war started. But, the truth of the matter is, memories start to fade. The war has been going for 5 months or so, and people don't care as much anymore. But the people in Cambodia are still there. We still need to make converts. We still need to just basically pay the bills, keep the churches open, keep with upkeep. Make sure that the priest doesn't have to beg for food, which is something he had to do at one point. So please support the Church of Cambodia. You are the tip of the spear. Go to orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. No spaces, dashes, anything. The link is also scrolling below, and it's in the info bar. So there you go. This has blessed you. This has given you evidence and research you've never seen before, which I know it has. Then please bless the ministry in Cambodia, and God will bless you, not financially, probably, but he'll bless you with faith, and he'll bless you with righteousness, because giving alms always does. So, John, with that, I just want to thank you again for coming on. It's always a pleasure. And I look forward to doing the 3rd century with you, hopefully in a month.
See you then.
All right, guys. Well, I will end the show as I end all of them by quoting Jesus Rock by saying, "Fight to the death for the truth, and the Lord God will fight for you." God bless you. Have a great day.